All right, well, I say we get started. Welcome everyone to the Health and Wellness Summit. I'm so happy to welcome all of our panelists and guests. My name is Erin Cunningham Ritter, representing the College of Arts and Sciences Be Well program, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this panel discussion titled Breaking the Cycle, Intergenerational Trauma, Part 2, featuring an esteemed group of panelists dedicated to research and in the support of individuals and communities experiencing intergenerational trauma. This panel discussion is a continuation of last year's Let's See You Well presentation called A Conversation About Intergenerational Trauma. That discussion focused on intergenerational or transgenerational trauma, highlighting trauma that has been passed down from survivors to their descendants. Themes focused on experiences of intergenerational trauma and the resulting psychological and emotional effects. Today's panel will give participants a deeper understanding of intergenerational trauma with a focus on resources and tools for healing. This panel is sponsored by the College of Arts and Sciences Office for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and Be Well. Before we get going, I'd like to cover a few logistics for today. Please note that closed captioning is available by clicking the live transcription button in the menu bar. This session is being recorded, and we will stop the recording for the question and answer session with the panelists at the end of the formal part of the panel. Now I'm pleased to introduce you to my co-moderator, Marisha Lopez, representing the College of Arts and Sciences JEDI program. Marisha, take it away.
Thanks, Erin. Hi, everyone. My name is Marisha Lopez, and I am the program manager for the Office for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the College of Arts and Sciences. Today, we have 4 highly regarded panelists with us who will delve into the topic of healing intergenerational trauma, exploring the ways in which the past impacts the present and the transformative power of healing for individuals, families, and communities. Our distinguished panelists will bring their expertise and personal experiences to shed light on this complex issue and offer insights into effective strategies and resources for healing and breaking the cycle of intergenerational trauma. I'd like to acknowledge that usually at this point, we would do a land acknowledgement. We are on a really tight schedule. So instead of a land acknowledgement, I am going to put in the chat here some resources for you all to explore in your own time, including the link to CU Boulder's land acknowledgement. Now, before we begin, I would like to welcome you all to this discussion and to briefly introduce our panelists. I will include links to the panelists' bios in the chat. And I'd like to ask each panelist to introduce themselves by their name and then their title within their organization. And we will begin with Carla.
Hello, everyone. My name is Carla Eugene. I am with the Faculty Staff Assistance Program. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Excited to be here today. My focus is on multiculturalism, and so I'm really excited on this topic, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Carla. Paulette.
Hi, everybody. I'm Paulette, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker with the Faculty and Staff Assistance Program and one of the co-founders of the Contemplative Resource Center. Glad to be here.
Jasmine.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? These AirPods have been giving me a bit of grief. Okay.
Yep.
I am Dr. Jasmine Peters. I use she and her pronouns. I was formerly the multicultural specialist and embedded therapist at the Counseling and Psychiatric Service, or CAPS, here at CU, and currently a research associate at the Renee Crown Wellness Institute and on the Mind, Body, Voice program. And it's good to be with you all here today.
And finally, Christina.
Hi, everyone. I am Christina Eklund. I work with the Contemplative Resource Center on campus. I'm also one of the co-founders along with Paulette. And before that, I worked for 9 years in the Office of Faculty Affairs. And prior to that, I was the managing editor at a publishing house that specialized in psychology and neuroscience, alternative health and spirituality, and meditation.
Thank you. And now I will pass it over to Erin to get the discussion started.
Welcome and thank you all of our panelists. Our first question will go to both Carla and Paulette. The question is, what is intergenerational trauma and how does it manifest in individuals and communities? Carla, would you like to start us off?
Sure, I can do that. So as you already mentioned when you started just the introduction for this session today, intergenerational trauma is just that, the trauma passed down between generations, or transgenerational trauma. One person can experience a traumatic event, and then that's passed down within the generations. It's not to be confused with generational trauma, which is like from one generation to the next and kind of just between the two. But when we talk about intergenerational, it's shared between generations, I'm sorry. It's also known as collective trauma, historical trauma, ancestral wounds, and so forth. Some examples would be like sexual and physical abuse, genocide, slavery, the Trail of Tears, someone who's been in internment camps, the Holocaust, refugees, colonization, decolonization, neo-colonization, domestic violence, alcohol and drug addiction, and maybe sudden death within a family, or like rape and unwanted pregnancy. With intergenerational trauma, there's this like uncontrollable fear of suffering, and it can stay with you in ways that you may not expect. There's this unresolved trauma that's passed down between your child to the next child, and until the cycle is broken. It also can happen in utero or environmentally. So there's research that's proven genetic changes can occur in our DNA that's called epigenetics. And that's something I would highly recommend you looking into, because it's just looking at how the gene functions and the changes as a result of trauma. Just briefly, I want to talk about long-term effects, and then I'm sure Paulette will also share some really great nuggets on this. But long-term effects could be, it can in fact impact your physiological, psychological, emotional health for a lifetime. This can look like emotional dysregulation, sleep disturbances, this detachment from your experience. We also call it like derealization or disassociation. There could be hyperarousal, or this like hypervigilance to stress. There's intrusive thoughts, post-traumatic stress disorder. There's Dr. DeGroot coined post-traumatic slave syndrome as a specific example of the psychological and behavioral effects.
I'm going to pause. Is Carla frozen on your end?
Yes, she is.
Okay, Paulette, maybe you could continue with this question and we'll welcome Carla back when the tech issues resolve.
Sounds good. I bet you she'll be back here in just a second. So to follow this thread, when you look at yourself and your own reactions in the world, whether they be maladaptive or adaptive, you can question whether or not the event happened to you. And if it did, it's post-traumatic stress in your life. And if it didn't, you can look at intergenerational trauma as perhaps the origin story of PTSD reactions in yourself. So I also like to think of it as a map. So your body holds a map that goes back generations. And what's been passed down are really survival skills, the ability to enjoy your life, to make connections, but also the ability to know when you're in danger and to protect yourself if you have to. So that's really what we're talking about. And I'll give it back to you, Erin.
Well, thank you for those broad explanations of intergenerational trauma. Marisha, why don't you, let's move on to the next question.
Yeah, thank you. So I'd like to acknowledge the fact that I think within a lot of families, within a lot of cultures, it's hard to even identify intergenerational trauma, to sort of accept these feelings, these reactions that we're having as anything but the norm. And I was wondering if Jasmine and Carla could speak to what role cultural identity and heritage play in understanding and addressing intergenerational trauma.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And so I think where I want to start with that question is kind of really differentiating between like trauma and distress. I think that when we, in the era of social media, right, there's so much useful information out there. And there's also an inherent misunderstanding that often occurs when we're talking about, you know, distressing situations, right? Like, oh, this is my trauma response. This is my intergenerational trauma, my generational trauma. And so when we're talking about distress, right, something that's negative, it's unwanted, it's difficult, it's challenging, and it deserves attention. It deserves attention. It deserves for us to be able to work through it. It deserves for us to be able to give space to it in order to remove the power from it. And also, distress is distress and trauma is trauma, whereas trauma is something that is perceived as life-threatening or threatening to the integrity of one's very being. And so when we're talking about the role that culture and identity might play in intergenerational trauma, what we're talking about is at what point, right, like did someone in your lineage feel that their very existence or the existence of their people was threatened, right? Was that their life and the integrity of their life was not guaranteed. And we know that historically marginalized populations primarily have a history of this in our lineage and in our ancestry. And so it has everything to do with intergenerational trauma. It's about how folks were able to survive, right? And so, you know, as was explained before, which is kind of like what intergenerational trauma is, it can look a lot like, you know, emotional unavailability, right? Or emotional immaturity, because perhaps existing when you are enslaved or when your people are experiencing genocide or when you are, again, internment camps or the Holocaust, right? Existing in that reality and feeling the full emotional effect of that is far too threatening, right? And so what you might see as a culture, as a population, as a generation, is that folks are not able to access those emotions, and that ends up getting passed down, right? These emotions are so threatening that if you were to exist in the reality of this, you may not survive this. If you were actually to accept this for what it is, that level of emotional connection to this very to the harm that's being done is so great that we actually have to distance ourselves from it. And so you pass down that distancing. And so, and when we're talking about systemic factors, right, because most of these have a systemic quality to them, then identity again comes up and is really centered, I think, in this conversation. It's really kind of the root of where these terms are coming from is, were you involved? What identities do you have? And were those identities involved in something that really felt traumatic, something that felt like it was compromising the integrity or the existence of these people that you are connected to? And how has that been passed down? How have you attempted to survive, right? Like, we're not even talking about thriving here. We're talking about just basic survival. And many folks with marginalized identities have that in their lineage and has been passed down to them. And it's very difficult to disentangle and to kind of understand, even because it's so common. And it's so, like, even just the narratives about survival are so rooted in some of those traumatic responses that asking someone to compromise their safety in order to heal might be a challenge. And I know that it looks like Carla's not come back just yet. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. I do know that Carla is trying to get back into the room, dealing with some technical difficulties, and she was going to respond to this. I just want to pause. Maybe Paulette and Christina, if you have anything to add, we can make space for that now. And if not, we can move on to the next question.
Sure, I'll just add, I'd like to just mention vicarious trauma, because I think that's an important aspect of it, is when if your parents have been traumatized and they're having flashbacks or panic attacks or other results of this trauma, or reliving or retelling their traumatic story, that can have an impact in itself. The other thing that came up for me is just thinking about that in various families, like this can differ, but there's often one or more emotions that are not okay to express in someone's family. So a lot of times that is anger. In my particular family, that is sadness. And, I can actually trace the historic, my ancestral hesitance of expressing any sadness, because it actually would have been life-threatening to pause and grieve and be sad. So that's just something I wanted to mention with that.
Has so many different lenses to explore these questions. So thank you for adding to this. Why don't I move on to the next question? And oh, here comes Carla. We'll welcome her back. Yay, Carla's here. So as she's getting back on, why don't I start off with the next question? This one will go to Paulette and Jasmine. What are some effective strategies or therapeutic approaches for healing intergenerational trauma? Paulette, maybe we could start with you and then we'll hand things over to Jasmine.
All right. So I'd like to start with a quote by a wonderful author, social activist, and trauma therapist named Resmaa Menakem. He is best known for his wonderful book, My Grandmother's Hands, which I recommend. And from his words, self and communal touch, self and communal orientation, self and communal grounding, self and communal movement. So you can see here that we begin with self and also include communal healing, beginning with the body, what we carry in the body, what moves through the body. And so we call this somatic work in our field, and it's the use of the body and all of the adaptive and maladaptive strategies that come through our bodies, right? Then to move out a little bit, there are other modalities that seem to work really well with intergenerational trauma. One of them is internal family systems or parts work, which is like old school inner child work, but updated for the modern day. Then mindfulness practices can sometimes be really helpful in building this curiosity and conscious awareness of our patterns, especially if they tend to be unconscious or outside of the realm of our consciousness. And then, of course, spiritual and religious traditions and the groundedness that exists in these wisdom traditions can be very, very helpful in accessing effective strategies to heal and move through any kind of trauma response. Jasmine, what do you think?
Yes, I appreciate everything that you've named, and I think that what I would like to add to that is really just, again, kind of understanding the gravity of what intergenerational trauma is. It is so directly and inextricably connected to survival that what we have to have is patience. Hey, Carla, you're back. That what you have to have is patience, right? And so you can engage in mindfulness, you can do EMDR, you can do, internal family systems, you can do all of this work. And if there was no stillness that existed in that healing process, then it might not turn out the way, it might not yield the healing that you may have hoped for. And so these things are so, they're so nuanced, they're so specific. I think it's really, it can be very, it can feel tempting to want to just kind of like hear the description and hear about some examples and then make those surface level connections and then just start to heal, right? Like, okay, so great, now I know that this is probably a trauma response. Let's go ahead and start healing. But if we haven't taken a step back to observe it, to understand it, to really look at it and be curious about it, ask those questions, where did this come from, right? What is actually linked to my current survival, or my family or my ancestors' current survival, or not ancestors' current survival, but my family, my community's current survival, and what is a relic of a past trauma that doesn't exist in the same way right now, right? Like really wanting to be patient in finding those answers and being open to the fact that they may change and they may not look the way that you thought that they did. And there might be certain trauma responses that feel even more important to you as a person currently in this reality, and also still might be relics of past trauma that you don't need anymore. And so really, I think the most important part of that process is going to be the patience It's going to be the stillness. It's going to be the willingness to interrogate and to listen to what your body is telling you, to what your mind is telling you, right? To what, if you're in therapy, what your therapist is trying to help guide you through, and be open to potential surprises and things that might disrupt the reality that you exist in right now, currently. And I don't know if, yeah, I'm not sure if Carla, if you wanted to jump in from the last question, if you want to jump in on this one, or if I'm calling you out and you would prefer that I'm not. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, and Jasmine and the rest of us, we talked a little bit about, should we bring up psychedelic assisted therapies? Like, is this something that this group might be interested in? It's relatively new on the scene, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did talk about whether or not to bring that up. I know that there's the
On the chat, it looks like we have some interest. So if you want to go over it a little bit.
Yeah, so I think one of the conversation that we ended up having is kind of right. There's psilocybin assisted treatment, there's ketamine, there's I think what has proved to be the most effective is MDMA, as Christina was naming, and that's not currently legal. And I think what we want to impart is, don't leave the space thinking that you can just go and get some shrooms or some acid and like do a trip and heal yourself. That is totally not at all the message that we want to give here. But we do think that there has been a lot of documented benefit from psychedelic assisted therapy. When there is what really is important about that, though, is kind of the integration piece, right? Being able to kind of go into that other part of your brain, maybe part that you don't have access to, kind of make sense of what it is that you're experiencing during that trip, during that therapeutic treatment, and also afterwards. It's the integration. It's like the meaning making. And so it's incredibly important to have someone, a trained professional, assisting you through before the treatment, during the treatment, and after the treatment. So it's not just this, it's not a one and done even. I believe that ketamine assisted therapy, there's several treatments that you go through over a certain period of time. And yeah, I don't know, Paulette, if you wanted to, or Christina or Carla, if y'all wanted to add anything to that.
No, you said it beautifully, Jasmine. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think the important thing is that we don't know a lot about it. It's relatively new, but it does seem to be quite promising. So we wouldn't ever say don't try it. Few warnings are that if you have a mood disorder, or if you have delusional disorders, then you just basically don't want to mess with your brain chemistry. This is for folks that have pretty solid, stable lives and brain chemistry. And so that's controversial in and of itself. But I definitely just wanted to put that out there, that it's being utilized and we're hearing some good things. But there are also lots of gentle ways to do this too. And I love, Jasmine, that you brought up having patience for yourself and patience for the process. Instead of jumping into the deep end, you don't have to do that. You can touch in a little bit, see how that feels, right? You can take it easy, right? Thank you.
Thank you for exploring that for us. It really is fascinating. And now that we've discussed strategies, therapeutic approaches, I'm wondering if we could go over what role forgiveness and reconciliation can play in the healing process from intergenerational trauma. And oh, Carla, you're back. Good. I would love to hear from Carla and from Christina.
Sure, I am so sorry. Our internet went out over here. We have an outage, and so it just came back on, which is perfect timing, right? So thanks for bearing with me. So when it comes to forgiveness and confronting trauma, I kind of want to talk a little bit about how we tend to have this all or nothing thinking when we experience something traumatic. It's either it was a terrible or horrible experience, or I'm okay with it and I'll get over it. And we tend to kind of feel like we have to be at one end of the spectrum or the other. Being that it's a terrible and horrible and unfair experience that our ancestors experienced or we experience ourselves, we tend to justify our reactions. But what that does is perpetuates negative patterns, resulting in living life from an unhealed place. So when it comes to forgiveness, I believe forgiveness springs forth from like this middle ground area. It's not one end of the spectrum. It's not either or, it's both and. I can both hate what happened to me or my people and be in search of joy and healing. So forgiveness isn't really about this singularity, it's this duality that sets us free. I can both be sad for the part of me that had to experience this traumatic situation or family issues and sit in it from the seat of reconciliation and resilience. I can both hold sadness and also want to spring forth from that. Because if we only hold on to sadness, anger, and bitterness, then it's exhausting. And you really don't yield any growth from that. So when we think about forgiveness, I want you to think about there's this therapy called dialectical behavior therapy, and it's therapeutic technique and skills for, one of them is for looking at distress tolerance, and it's called radical acceptance. And radical acceptance is designed to help you keep pain from turning into suffering. So with radical acceptance, it doesn't mean that you agree with the trauma. It means that you accept it as fact and it's what happened and it can't be changed. So the acceptance prevents ourselves from becoming like stuck in that unhappiness, that bitterness, that anger and sadness. And so eventually we would move from that to stop the suffering, and then we can take accountability and responsibility that will disrupt those negative patterns. So in order for us to begin to thrive and not just survive, forgiveness says that I can both be deserving of outrage and deserving of joy, this duality. In order to access that mental shift, though, it really takes you to be able to look from that middle ground to say, okay, what is this? How is this servicing me? Is this servicing me well to hold on to this? Or is there room for me to spring from this in order to grow in my own personal life and what I have for destiny, for future?
Thanks, Carla. I really appreciate that, because I know like trauma can be polarizing and it can make you see something as only one way or the other. So I love that you're saying the and in between. So when I think of forgiveness in relation to intergenerational trauma, I think of some circumstances where there's genuine remorse or where both parties are able to come to the table. There can be some sort of restorative justice. Then I think that's really wonderful when that can happen, but that's definitely not always going to be possible. There's some cases where the other party is maybe dead or physically incapable of remorse. With sociopathy, we know that to be true. And in those cases, where there's somebody that's been wronged and the other party just can't come to the table, there is a process where you can eventually come to peace within yourself, but it takes time. And I would just encourage people not to bypass the healing that's possible there, and not to bypass the emotions that you have there, because stuffing emotions is not healthy. Stuffing emotions is probably going to lead to future generations of trauma in your lineage. So look for a lesson that's there for you, and don't just jump to forgiveness too soon. But then one day, if you're ready to go to this place, it can be very freeing to know that forgiveness does not require reconnection. And one thing that the one thing I love to turn towards is this Greek word. It's an ancient Greek word, as opposed to modern Greek, ancient Greek word called aphiemi, and that's the word for forgiveness. And it also means to release or to set free. And so, forgiving the unforgivable can be something that we seek within ourselves for our own healing process. And when we don't forgive, we have this kind of just this kind of connection with this energetic connection, this energetic tie with this thing that we really don't want to be staying in connection with. And so finding forgiveness can be a way to set ourselves free from that. And I think one other thing I would say is, this is actually from one thing that my therapist says, is he says, like, I wish you well with your karma. And, you can say that to somebody that you love and somebody that you're not so fond of. And, I wish you well with the energetic repercussions of your actions.
Wow, thank you both for that really nuanced discussion of the role of forgiveness in trauma and intergenerational trauma. It certainly gave me lots to think about, but I do want to move on to our next question, which focuses a little bit more broadly. This question will be for Jasmine and Christina. In what ways can institutional leaders and supervisors support healing and recovery from intergenerational trauma? Jasmine, would you like to start us off?
Yes. There's so many different ways to answer this question, as we kind of discussed when we met as panelists. And I think what I maybe want to emphasize for the sake of the panel today is that, when we're talking, again, trauma, intergenerational trauma really is about where a person or a community was disempowered or had absolutely no control, right, in a situation. And in a situation that was life-threatening, or again, threatening to the integrity of one's being. And so when you're thinking about the institutions or, folks who hold more power, what are some of the common threads of some even more well-known traumas, some even more well-known harms or wrongs that have been committed in this world? Again, we've given examples of enslavement. We've given examples of internment camps. We've given examples of the Holocaust. We've given examples of genocide. We've given examples of just inherent abuse and misuse of power. And so what are ways in which that can show up in an institution? What are ways in which that can show up in your supervisory role? And how are you enacting some of those harms, right? Like where is that rigidity? Where is that abuse or unfair yielding of power? And how can you maybe be replicating what folks who are experiencing trauma are trying to work through, understand their trauma? What are you doing to potentially replicate some of those experiences and some of the need for that, for those trauma responses, the need for someone to maybe go inward or even go outward and look in order to look for safety? And I have to give Carla credit for this, because Carla was really the one that kind of like really rooted a lot of what I'm saying, that kind of like inspired what I'm saying. And I think if there's anything that you want to add, Carla, please jump in. But and also I think another piece of this is that the trauma itself is already wounding, and what can be even more wounding is the re-traumatization. So, having to prove something, having to very often people who are in marginalized positions, who have marginalized backgrounds and or have been wounded, are asked to really bare their whole soul before they're listened to, before they're believed, before it's actually given credence. Like their experience and what they're saying is given credence, and wanting to move back from that, away from that, right? And just kind of lean into trust and believing the believability of the people that you're interacting with and that you're interfacing with. And when they ask, what do you need then, right? What is it that you need in order to heal? And they tell you then to like respond and to listen and to hold that, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it doesn't feel like it aligns with what maybe a system is asking for, or requiring of you in your role as supervisor, manager, institutional leader, what have you. What are ways that you can distance yourself from that harm and actually lean into a more healing and restorative space? And again, it can be very uncomfortable and it can be very challenging to think in that way. And it's necessary if we're talking about actual healing and having a genuine and earnest interest in the well-being and the healing of the people around you. Yeah.
Thank you, Jasmine. A lot for us to think about, thinking about this theme of intergenerational trauma and how we interact in these spaces in this complex ecosystem here at CU. So thank you for that. Christina.
Yeah. So as Jasmine said, there's a lot of ways you could approach this particular question. I think I'd just like to share two very specific tools. And one is to normalize therapy. And you can do this in so many different ways. And one I actually just did with the last question. I just mentioned my therapist in conversation. I don't care who you are. You can mention that you have a therapist. You can be a therapist and mention you have a therapist. You can be a CEO and mention you have a therapist. It really doesn't matter. And going to therapy is not shameful. It's not something to be ashamed of. To me, it's actually something you can be proud of, because you're showing that you care enough about yourself to take care of your own mental health. And getting therapy is getting somebody else's brain to help you with your brain, to help you and support you with your mental processes, your emotions, and your senses. And it's really something special and in terms of self-care that we can do for ourselves. So normalize it, and maybe even provide flex time for it. So the second thing I wanted to talk about is you can bring discussions about values. And this is kind of what Jasmine was saying too, like actually really getting to know someone. But really, Glenda Russell, who used to work in camps at CU, she was a psychologist, and she once cited a study that really left an impression on me. And she talked about this study that they asked at the beginning of class. And the study showed that a student who is in any kind of minority in the classroom, asking at the beginning of the semester, what do you value? And just having the students write it down, and not even doing any follow-up after that, actually improved outcomes for the course. And I just think that's just so powerful. And we can bring values discussion in so many different ways. It can be a classroom, it can be something that, like Professor Dimogen at the Crown Institute had a whole values discussion as part of her formation of the Institute, and they have their values that they check in with. And it can be something you do with your friends. It can be something that you do as a supervisor in a group. And when you have a values discussion, you're really touching into the core of who you are. It's the same. Values are both our shared humanity. We all have them, and they are impacted by our ancestry and our life experiences, and so many other aspects of our lives. But they're also a way of touching in with our common humanity, and having those discussions can be very healing.
Thank you so much for that. I loved what you said, Christina, about normalizing therapy. I was actually in a class recently where the professor just mentioned, offhand while telling a story, oh, well, my therapist once said, and I did a double take. And then I thought later, like, why did I do a double take? And also thought about how much it meant to me that she said that she just, felt open to share that. I thought it was really lovely. So now I'd like to shift from, we've talked about sort of the focusing on the workplace, but I'm curious, how can the broader society and individual members of a community be more supportive and understanding of the experiences of those healing from intergenerational trauma? And for this question, I'd love to hear from Jasmine and Paulette.
Yeah, so again, you're gonna watch me reflect on how best to answer this. I think that the direction that I'd like to go with this question is really in naming something that hasn't been named, but it's been alluded to with it, which is identity-based stress and trauma, racial trauma based on racism, which is really, I think, at the core of what we're talking about when we're talking about intergenerational trauma. Groups of people being targeted because of their identity, because of their racialized background, and then holding certain patterns of behavior for survival. be less racist. Work on really addressing some of those isms, some of those phobias that are within you, right? How are you contributing to the maintenance of this system? How are you contributing to the maintenance of this harm? That is work that has been talked about over and over again, especially in more recent years, and it's still very challenging for people to see themselves in some of those patterns and some of those behaviors and the ways that they enact it, because of the fact that it can feel very threatening, right? It can feel very threatening to consider yourself somebody who harms other people by enacting racism, by engaging in homophobia, by engaging in transphobia, or whatever else it might be. And also, we are all indoctrinated to think in that way because of the system that we're in, because of the country that we're in, that is perpetuated over and over and over again, and in truth is also global. So, you know, really lowering those defenses and first of all, seeking to understand what people are talking about, what it looks like. Again, coming to panels like intergenerational trauma panels, going to conferences, doing trainings, reading books, engaging in documentaries, like other content. There's so much content out there where people are literally screaming at the top of their lungs, listen, this is what we're trying to say. And to be able to lower your defenses to engage with that material in order to make meaningful change and to be introspective. And this is also something that you can address in therapy, right? Like, how am I actually not showing up the way that I want to? What's coming up for me? What am I assuming? What meaning am I assigning to this thing? Someone said that I caused them harm here through microaggressions. What meaning am I then assigning to myself about what that means about me? Do I think that that means I'm a bad person? If so, let's maybe lower that defense and recognize that it just means that you committed a harm and you have an opportunity to also assist in some healing. And so really avoiding getting in your own way. I think community members, I think individual people, especially those of us who want to do the right thing, can really get in our own ways when it comes to actually having to take a step back and observe what that looks like on an individual level.
Beautiful. Thank you. So I guess, you know, the four of us will leave you with this, and we want to make this very personal. How will you, as a member of your community, be more supportive and understanding of the experiences of those healing from intergenerational trauma? How will you do your work? How will you read more about this? How will you acknowledge? How will you make reparations? How will you be patient? How will you learn more about all of this together, right? How will you get into your own body and feel it, right? So, yeah, it is personal. Thank you.
Wow, thank you for those comments and those prompts for reflection. I want to move on to our next question, and just going to be mindful of time. We've got to stop at 1:50, and so do want to try and leave some time for Q&A if possible. But our next question is, what steps can individuals take to promote healing within their families affected by intergenerational trauma? And would love to turn things over to Carla and Christina for this question.
Thank you. So the first thing that comes to my mind is confronting fear to access courage. Being able to confront family secrets, being able to confront even familial messages that are actually working against healing, the messages of what goes on in this house stays in this house, the messages of being able to cry or be sad is weak. Being able to confront the tendency to feel weak and leaning into what resiliency really means. We already talked about therapy. I really like to talk about circling back. It's okay to circle back to the person that has caused harm, or the thought that maybe is happening around you that you need to like really address and give space to, addressing family secrets and uncovering behaviors that are not servicing you well. So what that would mean is that I think it's important for us to engage in truth telling, being able to face the truth of our collective trauma. And doing that is not divisive. It's really the beginning of healing. So leaning into it, getting honest with yourself. Denial, I think, is another form that we didn't get a chance to really talk about, but I think that is another barrier to healing. And being able to avoid denial is really the path of healing and liberation. So taking the opportunity to say, what is really going on in me, in my family experiences? What patterns am I continue to uphold that really aren't good for me, but they just have always been? There's a psychologist named Dr. Thema Bryant who says we must recognize the social and political landmines that have exploded in our lives in those we love. Recognizing, as we talked about, you all talked about earlier, is really important, that we are not only recognizing what's happening around us, but recognizing what's happening in us, that we are worthy of a full range of emotions, we are worthy of our feelings, to be unapologetic, and to be patient with ourselves. So managing expectations of others, that on this journey, somebody mentioned it before about forgiveness, that other people may not be ready to go with you, and that's okay. Being able to set a boundary on your healing journey is so important, to say, hey, just because I've forgiven this person doesn't mean they're going to go with me. That might be a separation, that may be even ending that relationship. But knowing that in your journey of healing that might happen in order to stop the cycle is something that I would highly regard and say is an important factor.
Thank you, Carla. Christina.
Yeah, so as we work on healing trauma in various ways, I think it's also important to remember to increase our supports. And so I want to bring up what I think we can call intergenerational treasures. And just as something that you can keep an eye out in your own lineage as you're going through this work is, so here's what I mean. What I mean by intergenerational treasures is, like, you know, just as we inherit some traits that we love, like I have strong teeth, we also have inherited things that we don't love so much. Like I have a tendency towards bunions. Thanks, Mom, if you're watching. And you know, there's the same thing in terms of ancestral trauma. We have this trauma that comes through, but there's also incredible strengths. If your lineage is still carrying on, you've made it. In some way, you've made it, right? And there are incredible treasures. Like in my own family, there is the strength that it took to leave behind every single worldly possession with your children on foot to cross a border to an uncertain future. And that strength is in my blood. I have that forever. So I just encourage you to also look for your own intergenerational treasures.
Thank you. I wanted to include in the chat some resources for you all, and panelists, if I've left anything off from there, feel free to add links in the chat. We are going to stop recording